Today, I'm going to speak about what I think are some issues, emerging issues that are coming up in forensic science, and particularly in the legal arena, because forensic science, after all, is played out in the courts and in criminal investigations. The important thing to remember about our profession is that we're attempting to use science to achieve justice, to make sure that the uh, persons who are innocent of crimes are not unjustly prosecuted or convicted, and also to bring wrongdoers to justice. My talk today is not going to be a how-to review of different forensic science techniques, but to discuss some of the uh, challenges that forensic scientists may be facing in the near future. And while all of these may or may not be prevalent yet in India, we are seeing them in the US and a number of other countries around the world, and I'm pretty certain you'll be facing those things as well. When I'm speaking before groups from other countries, I always remind people that my perspective is one from the United States, and these experiences and ideas that I'm presenting to you may or may not be relevant in your particular area of the world, and I encourage you to either adopt those that you feel are important or just simply reject any of my conclusions. I certainly will not take offense of any of those things. If you want to follow me, I'm on both LinkedIn and Twitter. I regularly post what I consider to be interesting news articles and research and what have you on those two platforms on a fairly regular basis. And if you if you want to see what I have to say, I certainly encourage you to check in on these things, and you can feel free to drop me a line if you have any specific questions after the talk. This morning, or rather this afternoon, I'm speaking to you from home in an area called Indio, California. It's a desert community which I retired to, located about 200 k's west of Los Angeles, and it's in a desert area known as the Coachella Valley. It gets pretty hot here in the summertime. It can get as high as 80 degrees C, but in the winter it's quite pleasant. But it is a very dry area. So when we think about forensic science, of course, we're dealing with legal issues. You can have any sort of science involved in these kinds of cases, but because they're presented in courtrooms, we attach the word forensic to them. And the reason for this is that courts, judges, lawyers, juries can't be expected to be expert in all things, and certainly in complex areas involving science, technology, and medicine. They need expert witnesses to come in and explain to them what's going on, how these things affect a particular case. And in order to be an effective witness, it's essential to be able to explain your findings, the way in which you conducted your studies, your research in a way that non-scientists are able to understand what you're talking about. It's quite easy when you're surrounded by science persons to lapse into scientific-ese, where the average person may not have an idea of what it is you're talking about. It's important to keep in mind that as forensic science becomes more prevalent and more important, lawyers, trial lawyers, are quickly learning how to question expert witnesses about what their findings are. And again, it's important to be able to explain to these individuals and the courts, the judges, uh, what your findings actually mean and how they play into a particular case in time. I'm going to give you here a list of areas that I expect are going to become very important. Some of them have already taken off, but others are relatively new. Certainly, artificial intelligence is one area in computers and use of IA to uh, do some of the work that we do and come up with some conclusions. Firearms is a major area, and we're seeing a unique problem here in the U.S. and a few other places around the world involving something called ghost guns, meaning that these are weapons that can be either purchased as individual parts or even manufactured by uh, printing parts of the gun on a computer, on a 3D computer device, and these can be used in crimes. Of course, these types of weapons have no serial numbers and cannot be traced back to a particular user. The biggest issue, the biggest technique in the past decade or more, of course, has been DNA typing. And that's had a very, very important role in solving crimes and bringing people to justice. And those countries that have been able to establish national databases to be able to identify criminals, people who have committed crimes in the past, are making considerable use of this particular area. Genetic genealogy is an area that's become recently important. Here in the U.S., people seem to be really interested in using DNA to track their ancestors, their family history, and there are a group of genealogists who have combined DNA with genealogy to try to use it to identify people that have been involved in crimes, if not the actual person, but to at least to limit the number of people the police have to investigate by identifying perhaps brothers, sisters, parents, children, and the like. Robotics has played a very rich role in forensic science, particularly in techniques that are routine and have to be performed over and over again. You see robotics used in toxicology laboratories and, of course, in DNA laboratories and in other areas. One of the big areas that we are faced with these days is the area of terrorism, identifying individuals who commit acts of terror on individuals. Of course, if you have mass casualties, that's an added problem in these instances, but terrorism in some form has an effect on forensic capabilities. Digital evidence is a big area that has gained considerable use in the last few years in terms of finding out what information is on a computer, looking at other types of electronic devices such as smartphones and tablets and what have you to get information that may be pertinent to a criminal investigation. New drugs are constantly being having to be dealt with. There's a new area in forensic toxicology called NPS, or novel psychoactive substances, which are variations of traditional control substances that need to be addressed in some fashion in law enforcement environments. Comparative analysis, I'm going to be speaking about that in a little bit, dealing with some types of trace evidence as well as evidence where you're comparing one thing with another. So let's consider some of the future issues that we need to be thinking about. One of the major ones that has come up recently is the use of statistics, and I'm going to be circling back to this notion as we go along. Once DNA began to be used in criminal cases, examiners have been able, because of the amount of medical research done on the genomes of individuals, to give statistical interpretations of what the evidence actually means. And there's been a push to be able to use statistics in other areas of forensic science. Of course, the challenge there is that statistics are not always available. And I suspect that as we move forward, curricula in universities are going to have a component involving statistics to be able to use to explain evidence. Another issue that we see being raised is the question of bias. And I'm not necessarily meaning bias in terms of willful bias where people are doing things consciously to harm other individuals. I'm talking about bias that you don't even know that it exists, because evidence may be brought to you by the police and they give you some information about a case that really has nothing to do with the examination of the evidence, that may color your interpretation of that evidence. Opinion testimony, of course, this is what we're all about, whether it's writing reports, expressing your conclusions about an analysis that you've done, or giving evidence in court. You're offering an opinion, and that opinion is being scrutinized by a lot of lawyers these days to try to discern what it is that you mean. Ethics is a hugely important subject in our particular field. There's no way of doing a wrong thing right. Two wrongs don't make a right. It's very important to have professional standards in terms of what it is you're doing. Accreditation and certification of laboratories and individuals is becoming more and more important as we go forward, as a means to tell everybody who uses forensic science that the laboratory is efficient, does good work, and that the individual knows what they're doing. A question that I think is worthwhile considering, and I'll speak a little bit more about this later on in my talk, is the nature of proof. What are facts? How do we express what these things mean? And along with that, the idea of subjectivity versus objectivity, and this has to do with knowledge that we possess. So statistics, as I mentioned, are gaining more importance over time. And the question is, how do you quantify it? How do you express the level of certainty that you have when you're doing an assay, a test of an item? Is it fair to just say that the items are similar, they're consistent? Language is a problem. Statistics, however, gives you some means to express the level of certainty that you're dealing with. So when you have terms like consistent with, similar to, sameness, what do these things actually mean? Can you quantify these things, or even more pertinent, and this is more of a philosophical kind of issue, can you actually state that two items are similar and share a common, unique source? If you go back to the 17th and 18th century philosophers, they wrestled with this notion of similarity, and this question is coming up again in the legal arena. I mentioned about bias. Here we're talking about contextual bias, meaning this occurs when an expert is given extraneous information which may or may not influence the person, causing the objectivity of the person to be biased. In other words, let's assume a detective comes to you holding some evidence and says, we collected this from an individual who's got a criminal record, and we believe it to be material evidence in a particular case. Does that kind of preamble to what you're doing in a laboratory environment color the way in which you are approaching your tests and any conclusions you may have? So this is something that exists probably in a subconscious level, and has to be there needs to be some kind of concern. So what is the requirement for experts to inform courts about their opinions? What happens when there's only a limited amount of data, where you do not have the exquisite kinds of statistics that are present in, say, DNA testing? When you are looking at, say, shoe prints or tire impressions, and you have accidental markings that show up in the cast, and compared with the tire or the shoe, you wind up having to deal with subjective opinions based on your training and experience. And some people are suggesting that that kind of information ought not be considered by the courts, but as I said before, ultimately it's the court's decision to decide what sort of expert testimony is allowable to be presented to the court. And ultimately, I think that it's essential for any expert to be able to explain the strengths and limitations of the work that they're doing. If there are not adequate statistics out there, just own up to it and say, well, they're not there. These conclusions are based on my training and experience. So finally, Education, training, continuing education, certification are important to demonstrate that you as a forensic scientist are competent and able to give evidence in these cases. The laboratory's accreditation will also become an important consideration in any of the work that you do.